Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. We always like to get into uh, kind of these like meaty topics in education, and today is a really good one.
It is,
I
yeah.
think it's one that everyone has probably thought about, even if they haven't read the literature on it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this idea of, what is education really for?
Right.
Right? Like, what's the point?
Yeah.
Obviously, we're not just, trying to cram kids' heads with a bunch of facts.
Right, just for the sake of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and we want them to be able to do something with that knowledge.
Yeah.
But what is that something? And we have this really interesting article by David Moshman from 1990
Yeah.
called Rationality as a Goal of Education.
That's right.
And so we kind of want to do a deep dive today into this idea of rationality.
Sure.
And maybe to kind of start us off, you could tell us a little bit about, Moshman critiques two of the more common approaches to this question of what education's for.
Sure.
And maybe you could just briefly outline those for us before we jump into the idea of rationality.
Yeah, so the two most common approaches I think in education are, one is focused on development. And so this is really just focused on nurturing the student. And the other is a focus on thinking skills. So teaching students how to think.
Right. So one is like much more internal, right?
Exactly.
Like the development side of it is like, they will naturally come to
Exactly. It's like a seed.
understand certain things.
Yeah, you plant the seed and you watch it grow.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other one is much more like hands-on, like tools.
Yes.
Very much
Yeah.
so.
Yep. And Moshman kind of takes a step back and asks, what's the underlying capacity that we're actually trying to develop here
Right.
with both of these approaches? And his answer is rationality.
Rationality.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah,
and he has kind of a specific definition for rationality.
he does.
It's not just,
Being logical or
being logical.
Yeah.
But it's this very
it's self-reflective.
Yeah.
It's intentional and appropriate coordination and use of genuine reasons in generating and justifying beliefs and behavior.
that's a mouthful.
It is.
Right. So
Yeah.
can we break that down a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's unpack that a little bit.
All right.
So self-reflective.
Self-reflective means that you're aware of your own thought process. You're thinking about your thinking.
Okay.
Intentional means you're reasoning with a purpose. So you're not just going through the motions. You're actually trying to reach a conclusion or make a decision for a reason.
Okay.
The appropriate coordination and use of genuine reasons. That means that you're using good evidence. You're connecting the dots in a way that makes sense.
Okay.
And finally, it's not just about having these reasons in your head. It's about actually using them to inform your beliefs and your actions.
Right. So it's not just like, I don't know, like a defense mechanism for
Exactly.
things you already believe.
It's not just justification. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's about actually generating them as well. Cool. So for our listeners today on the deep dive,
Yeah.
we're going to be kind of going through why Moshman thinks rationality is so important in education. And we're going to break that down by looking at, what it looks like, as humans develop.
Right.
But before we even get there, I kind of want to start with like the big why. Like
The philosophical justification.
Yes. Thank you. The philosophical justification.
Yeah.
And I think that this is really interesting because he's not just saying rationality is good because, it helps you achieve your aims.
Right.
He's also saying it's good in and of itself.
Exactly. Yeah. He argues that it's both a means to positive ends and an end in itself.
Okay, so let's start with that means part.
Yeah.
Like, how does it help us achieve positive ends?
So if you think about it on a personal level, if you're thinking rationally, you're much more likely to make good decisions that help you achieve your goals. You're weighing evidence. You're considering consequences. You're not just acting on impulse.
Right, it's like that, measure twice, cut once kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you want to think it through before you just jump into something.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you zoom out from the individual level and think about the community, a community full of rational thinkers is going to be much better equipped to solve problems, to innovate, to thrive economically.
Right. It's like if you have a room full of people who can think clearly about a problem, you're much more likely to find a solution.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, of course, Moshman, being, writing this in the context of the U.S., he points out that for a democratic society, rational citizens are absolutely essential for making informed political choices.
Right. So you can't really have a functioning democracy
if people aren't thinking rationally about
no one's thinking clearly about the issues.
the issues. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've got individual success, community well-being, functioning democracy, all good stuff.
Yes. Very important.
Okay, so now let's get to this idea of rationality as an end in itself.
Yeah.
Like, what's so good about it just on its own?
So this is where it gets really interesting because Moshman connects rationality to the very concepts of personal autonomy and dignity.
Okay.
And his argument is that to be truly autonomous, to be in control of your own thoughts and actions, you need to be able to think rationally.
Right. So if you're just taking everything on faith or just doing what you're told,
Right.
you're not really making your own choices.
You're not really free, are you?
Yeah. And he really connects that to this idea of, being a free person, which is, super important.
Yeah, absolutely central to
A democratic society.
our understanding of what it means to be human in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Okay. So that kind of reframes it a little bit. Like, it's not just that it's helpful.
Right.
It's that it's like essential to being a free person.
It's fundamental.
Yeah. Okay. Now, one of the things that I think a lot of people worry about with education is this idea of indoctrination.
Right.
And so I'm curious, how does this idea of promoting rationality fit into that?
Yeah, so some people might hear this and think, oh, are we just trying to create like little robots who all think the same way?
Right.
But Moshman actually argues that it's the opposite,
Okay.
that fostering rationality is actually the best defense against indoctrination.
Okay.
Because if you teach students to think for themselves, to critically evaluate ideas, to really examine the reasons behind those ideas, you're giving them the tools to resist just blindly accepting what they're told.
Right. So it's not about giving them the right answers.
Exactly.
It's about teaching them how to figure out.
It's about the process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And he even addresses, like, is this just another form of indoctrination?
He does.
Yeah, like, are we indoctrinating people into rationality?
Right. And he says, well, true rationality, as he defines it, is self-reflective. So a truly rational person will even question rationality itself and the limits of rationality.
Right. So it's not like a dogma.
It's not.
It's like a process.
It's a process.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's the philosophy behind it. And he makes a pretty compelling case.
Yeah.
But what does psychology tell us about how this actually develops?
Right. So that's the interesting thing. He points out that rationality hasn't really been systematically studied in psychology.
Okay. So we don't have like a ton of data.
Yeah, not in the way that he thinks it should be studied. No.
Right.
Psychology has looked at how people reason, whether people's conclusions are logical or not. But Moshman's point is that rationality is more than just being logical. It's about that intentional, self-aware use of reasons.
Okay.
So he actually delves into the development of deductive rationality.
Okay. So for listeners who might not know what that is, can you just give us a quick? Sure.
So deductive rationality is this kind of reasoning where if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true.
Okay.
So it's that kind of like airtight logic.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So how does that develop in kids as they grow up?
So what's interesting is that even very young children, like preschoolers, they might actually get the right answer in a logic problem, but they don't really understand why it's the right answer.
Okay.
They're not reflecting on those steps involved. They're not seeing it as a conclusion that follows from premises.
Right. It's more like an observation.
It is.
Than an actual, piece
Sure,
of
exactly. Yeah, it's just like, the cookies are all gone.
Right.
It's just a statement of fact.
Yeah.
Not necessarily understanding that follows from the fact that they ate all the cookies.
Okay.
But then around age 5 or 6, you start to see a shift. And children become more aware of their own thinking. They can start to grasp this idea that if this is true, then this other thing must also be true.
Okay.
They start to understand that you can figure things out through reasoning, not just by directly observing them.
Right. So it's like a light bulb moment.
Yeah, that there's this connection between pieces of information.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool. And then what happens next?
So at around 11 or 12, kids develop an even more explicit understanding of logical form, and they can distinguish between whether an argument makes sense internally, like does the conclusion follow logically from the premises, and whether those premises are actually true in the real world.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so he gives this classic example. If elephants are either animals or plants, and elephants are not animals, then elephants are plants.
Right.
And so kids this age can see that the logic holds. Even though they know elephants aren't plants,
Right.
they understand that the structure of the argument is valid, even if the conclusion itself is false.
Right.
And they also start to get their heads around things like, statements that are always true, so like tautologies, or
Okay.
statements that are always false, contradictions.
Okay.
And they can start to see how logic is different from other kinds of knowledge.
Right.
So they're not just thinking about the content of the arguments anymore. They're thinking about the structure.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
And then does it go any further than that, or is that kind of like the...
Well, so Moshman suggests that highly educated adults might reach a fourth stage, where they have this really sophisticated understanding of different logical systems and how they relate to language and all of that.
Okay.
But for our purposes, I think the key is that increasing ability to intentionally and reflectively use deductive reasoning
Yeah.
as we mature.
Okay, cool. So that's deductive reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
What about inductive reasoning?
Right.
So that's, going from specific evidence to general conclusions.
Exactly.
How does that work?
So again, very young kids make inductive leaps all the time. They see one dog bark and assume all dogs bark.
Right.
But they're not reflecting on how solid that assumption is. They don't really distinguish between their own perception and reality.
Right. It's like if I've seen it, it must be true
Exactly. Yeah.
for everyone.
Yeah. But then around age 4, they start to realize that their beliefs might not actually match reality and that other people can have different perspectives.
Okay.
And by 6 or 7, they generally understand that you can't always trust appearances,
Yeah.
that you need evidence to support your beliefs. So that's when you get all the why questions.
Yeah.
Why do you think that?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then around 11, adolescents become more aware of the distinction between a theory and the data that supports or contradicts it.
Okay.
And they start to intentionally test their ideas by looking for evidence that might actually prove them wrong.
Ooh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it's that idea of seeking falsifying data.
Right. Instead of just looking for things that confirm what you already think,
Exactly.
you're actually trying to disprove yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
But even then, Moshman notes that, adults aren't always great at actually doing that consistently.
Right. We're all biased.
We are, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, he suggests that there might be this fourth stage
Yeah.
of really sophisticated understanding about the nature of knowledge and how we justify what we believe.
Okay.
So in both deductive and inductive reasoning, we see this trend towards more intentionality
Right.
and self-awareness in how we use reasons.
Okay, cool. Now he also talks about moral rationality.
He does.
And he kind of connects that to Kohlberg's stages of moral development.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So Kohlberg's theory of moral development basically outlines these stages of how our moral thinking becomes more complex over time.
Okay.
So you start with very simple rules, based on avoiding punishment.
Right, like don't do this or
Yeah.
you'll get in trouble.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And then you move to understanding the idea of give and take and reciprocity.
Okay.
Then to understanding the importance of relationships.
Okay.
Then to thinking about broader societal rules.
Okay.
And then finally to analyzing social systems
Yeah.
based on abstract principles of justice.
Wow.
So you're moving from these very concrete rules
Right.
to much more abstract principles.
Yeah.
And at each stage, you're thinking more deeply about the why.
Right. So it's not just about following the rules.
Exactly.
It's about understanding why those rules exist.
Yeah, what's the reasoning behind them?
Yeah, that's really cool. And so he uses this term reflective abstraction.
He does, yeah.
To kind of describe this development across all of these different areas.
Yeah, so it's this idea from Piaget.
Okay.
And you can think of it like learning to ride a bike.
Okay.
At first, you're just kind of trying to balance. You're not really thinking about what you're doing.
Right.
But then you fall off.
Right.
You reflect on what happened
Sure.
and you adjust your technique.
Okay.
And each time you do that, you're engaging in a reflective abstraction.
You're thinking about your thinking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you're building a more sophisticated understanding.
Okay, so it's like this constant process of
Yeah, it's like a spot.
building on
Mhm.
what you already know.
Yeah, you're taking what you know,
Yeah.
you're looking at it quickly, and then you're building something new.
That's really cool. Okay, so now I know that the people who focus on like teaching thinking skills
Right.
might have some critiques of this kind of developmental perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of those? So one of the main critiques is that, these developmental stages are kind of broad and they don't always give us really specific details about the mental processes involved in reasoning.
Right. It's more like a big picture.
It's a framework
Yeah.
rather than like a step-by-step guide
Yeah.
to how to think.
Okay.
And the other main critique is that by focusing on this kind of internal unfolding of rationality, The developmental perspective might underestimate the importance of actually teaching specific thinking skills
Okay.
because there's evidence that, you can teach people how to analyze arguments, how to solve problems, and they can get better at them.
Right. So there's something to be said for that kind of direct instruction.
Exactly.
Okay. So how do we bring these two together?
Right. So Moshman suggests that learning these thinking skills isn't
Yeah.
just passively absorbing them.
Okay.
You have to actively make sense of them in relation to your current understanding. And for those skills to really contribute to your rationality, you need to understand why they work. You need to be able to justify using them, and you need to be able to consciously choose to apply them.
Okay.
It can't just be like rote memorization of steps.
Right. It's not just a recipe.
Yeah, it's not just a trick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So how do we help students get to that point where they're not just,
Right.
blindly following the steps?
So he sees it as kind of this back and forth
Yeah.
between your internal development and the skills that you learn from the outside world.
Okay.
So learning a new skill can actually create a kind of imbalance in your thinking, and that can push you to reflect and develop a more sophisticated understanding.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so if you think back to the hypothesis testing example, the developmental approach might be to, create conditions where the student kind of discovers the importance of seeking disconfirming evidence.
Okay.
Whereas the thinking skills approach would be to directly teach that strategy.
Yeah.
But Moshman's integrated view is that learning that skill can actually lead to that aha moment, that developmental shift in understanding.
Okay. So they kind of work together.
They do, yeah.
The teaching can lead to the development.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Now, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is like just knowledge.
Right, content knowledge.
Yeah, like it seems like you can't really think rationally.
You gotta have something to think about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So how does content knowledge fit into all of this?
That's a really crucial point. And historically, there's been this kind of back and forth. At first there was this big emphasis on general intelligence,
Okay.
general logic skills.
Yeah.
And the idea was that those would apply to everything.
Okay.
Then the pendulum swung the other way, and there's this big emphasis on expertise in specific subjects.
Okay.
But now I think there's this growing consensus that you need both. You need those general reasoning abilities, and you need specific knowledge,
And they work together.
and they work together. And Moshman really stresses that for knowledge to be used rationally, the knowledge itself needs to be well supported by evidence.
Okay.
The person using it needs to understand that evidence,
Okay.
and they need to be intentionally applying that knowledge.
So it's not just enough to know like a bunch of facts about history.
Right.
You also have to understand like how we know those facts.
Exactly, and
Yeah.
how they fit together, and how to use them to make arguments.
Right. And to think critically
Yeah.
about, historical events or whatever it is.
Yeah, and he even talks about this dark side of expertise, where sometimes people who have really deep knowledge in a particular area can become resistant to new ideas if they haven't also developed that reflective, critical approach.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah, so it can actually be a hindrance.
Right. Your own knowledge can get in the way
It can.
if you're not thinking rationally about it.
If it's not flexible, it's not open to revision.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Okay. So we've covered, the philosophical why,
Mhm.
the psychological how. Now, what about the practical implications?
Yeah.
Like, how do we actually bring this into the classroom?
So Moshman is very careful to say that. He's not offering like a specific curriculum. He's
Right.
offering more general recommendations,
Huh.
but he does have some ideas for different age groups.
What are those?
So with really young kids, like preschoolers, it's all about getting them to articulate their thoughts.
Okay.
So encouraging them to say what they believe, describe what they're doing, and offer reasons, even if those reasons aren't, perfect or fully formed.
Right. So it's more about just starting that process.
Exactly. It's about building that habit.
Connecting actions and beliefs to reasons.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. What about elementary school?
So in elementary school, you can start to introduce more systematic ways of thinking.
Okay.
So you can have discussions about, how we reach conclusions based on information, what kind of evidence supports a claim. You can start to explore concepts of fairness and why they're important in our interactions with others.
Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of getting into the idea of like, different perspectives.
Yeah.
And
how we weigh evidence.
yeah, how do we know it's true?
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. And then what about as kids get a little bit older
Mm-hmm.
into secondary school?
So adolescents are ready for more abstract thinking.
Okay.
So you can start to delve into, the structure of logical arguments. You can explore the logic of scientific investigation,
Hmm.
especially that idea of trying to disprove your own hypotheses.
Yeah.
And you can really start to examine the underlying principles of morality and ethics.
Right. So we're kind of getting into like,
The nitty-gritty.
yeah, the really like abstract ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in higher education,
Mm-hmm.
college and beyond, you can continue those discussions at an even more advanced level with students really taking more ownership of their learning.
Okay.
So you can explore things like the nature of logic itself,
Yeah.
different ethical frameworks, the very foundations of knowledge and belief.
Right. So we're getting super meta.
We are, yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. So how does he see this fitting into like the structure of school?
Mm-hmm.
Like, should we have, Rationality 101?
Right. Should it be its own subject?
Yeah, as a required course.
So he actually argues for a combination of approaches.
Okay.
He thinks it's important to kind of weave this focus on rational thinking throughout all subjects
Okay.
so that students see how it applies in different contexts in science and history and literature.
All right. It's not just like a standalone skill.
Exactly. It's something that you use everywhere.
Yeah.
But he also sees value in having, dedicated integrated courses that specifically focus on, the principles of reasoning and argumentation.
Right. So like a little bit of both.
Yeah. I think he sees them as working together.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, how does this goal of, fostering rationality
Mm-hmm.
fit in with some of the other things that we think about
Yeah.
when we think about education?
Right.
Like, passing on knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
teaching values,
Yeah.
social traditions.
Right. All those big things.
Like, how does rationality kind of fit into that bigger picture?
So when it comes to knowledge, Moshman's argument is that the goal isn't just to fill students' heads with facts.
Right.
It's to help them understand why those facts are considered to be true
Okay.
and how they fit into a larger understanding of the world.
Right. So it's the why
Yeah,
behind the what.
exactly. Yeah, it's about the justification
Yeah.
behind the knowledge.
Okay.
And he sees general reasoning skills and content knowledge
Yeah.
as really complementing each other.
Right. They have to work together.
Yeah.
Okay. What about values and morality?
So this is a tricky one.
Yeah.
Because schools, are often grappling with how directly they should address these things.
Right.
But Moshman kind of suggests a middle ground.
Okay.
He doesn't think that schools should just dictate a specific set of values,
Okay.
but he also doesn't think that they should just leave students completely adrift. So instead, he advocates for, modeling positive values and encouraging students to think critically and rationally about different moral perspectives.
Right. So teaching them how to think about morality,
Examine
not just
it.
telling them what's right and wrong.
Yeah, what to believe.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. And what about social traditions?
So Moshman argues that rationality actually requires a reflective approach to tradition
Okay.
because you can't really evaluate a tradition unless you understand it deeply.
Right.
So learning about social traditions is important,
Okay.
but the ultimate goal is for students to be able to think critically about them, to understand their origins and their justifications, and to decide for themselves what to embrace and what to question.
Right. So it's not about just blindly following tradition.
Exactly.
It's about understanding it and then making your own decisions.
Yeah, and he even points out that the pursuit of rationality itself is a long-standing intellectual tradition.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, so it's not like we're, throwing out tradition altogether.
Right.
We're actually engaging in a tradition.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So we've talked about how rationality fits into society,
Mm-hmm.
but what about how it fits into, the individual student?
Right.
Like, how does it relate to things like emotions,
Yeah.
creativity?
So some people might worry that, this emphasis on logic and reason could stifle emotions.
Right. Like it's too cold and calculating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Moshman actually argues that rationality isn't about suppressing feelings.
Okay.
In fact, he suggests that truly rational commitments can actually have a really strong emotional component.
Oh, interesting.
He even uses this term rational passions,
Okay.
and he sees a critical attitude as involving both thinking and feeling.
Right. So you're not just a brain in a jar.
Exactly.
You're a whole person.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And what about creativity?
So does this emphasis on reasoned thinking kind of box in creative expression?
All right.
Moshman says no.
Right.
He sees creativity as involving both generating new ideas
Uh-huh.
and then evaluating those ideas And rationality plays a really crucial role in that evaluation process.
Right, so it's not just about coming up with crazy ideas.
Right.
It's about being able to tell.
It's about being able to sift through them
Yeah.
and see which ones are actually good.
Which ones actually make sense.
Yeah, and he even argues that the development of rationality itself, through that reflective abstraction we talked about, is actually a creative act.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so they're not enemies.
They actually kind of support each other?
They do. Yeah, they're partners.
Okay, cool. So, it seems like, what, Moshe?